Okay, so as you've just heard, my field is Jewish thought in the modern period, and my focus has been America and Israel, although I do range a little more widely. Science has not been one of the foci of my work, but when I started writing a personal theology, as soon as I stepped down as being chancellor of JTS, I realized how much one's thoughts about science and religion impinge on one's thinking about God and what it is to be a religious human being in the world. And so I called this talk Judaism, Science, and the Search for the Hiding God, figuring that even though the first two words in the title, Judaism and Science, are controversial, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and there's differences of opinion about what they are and where their boundary lines are and how they relate to each other, but I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about my theology book, which is called Seeking the Hiding God. And this is the first time I've given this talk. So I decided I'm going to read it. I'll try to read it in a way that doesn't bore you and that you can follow. I'll try to go slowly. And there'll be lots of time for questions and discussions at the end. But I tried to be precise. I wanted to capture something that I was thinking about this a lot, and so you'll forgive me for reading a talk, I hope. All right. I called the book Seeking the Hiding God because that is what I believe Jews of faith do in any century, and particularly in this one. It is also what Jewish theologians, with few exceptions, have done all along. According to the Torah, God's countenance cannot be seen by anyone, even the prophet Moses, when he's called by God to the top of Mount Sinai following the people's worship of the golden calf. The fashioning of visual or sculpted images of God, such as that calf, is strictly prohibited. So is pronunciation of God's personal four-letter name. There is much about God, nearly everything, that mere mortals cannot know. But, and here theology comes into play, verbal images and conceptions of God have proliferated over the centuries, as they do in this same chapter of the book of Exodus. Reports of encounters with God or experiences of God have been many and varied, driven by longing, need, a sense of calling, or what sociologist Peter Berger called signals from the transcendent, signals from what lies beyond our limits. Jewish theologians over the centuries have disagreed about whether one can speak about what God is or only about what God is not. Can one say where God is or only where God has been or will be? Should we keep silent about God, given how little we will ever know with any certainty? Or shall we sing or write poetry or exercise imagination and sometimes stutter, as Moses does, and as one does when in love, in the hope that the words or melodies at our disposal will somehow suffice? That's the spirit in which I undertook the writing of a personal theological essay, personal because it arises out of my own experience, and an essay because it makes no pretense of finality or capital T truth. I began working on it when I stepped back from 14 years as the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and my 70th birthday approached, believing that after nearly 50 years of scholarship on modern Judaism, 40 plus years of marriage, 30 plus of parenthood, and 14 years of training rabbis and educators to speak about God and Torah, an account to what I myself believed about these matters was long overdue. I was determined to write a theology that is accessible to any thoughtful reader. No PhD degree or rabbinic ordination is required. No Jewish identity or affiliation is assumed. Everyone is welcome to search for God with me. I want to share several elements of that account with you all this morning in the context of two sets of beliefs and practices that shape my thinking and constrain my imagining, and these two, of course, are Judaism and science. For some Jews I know, the search for God belongs entirely on the Judaism side of that pairing, and only on that side, science being another domain entirely, and a godless one at that. For others, it is science that necessarily directs the search for God in the modern world, or decrees that search a total waste of time. Spinoza has not been the only Jew to maintain that the laws of nature are the laws of God, and that nature's laws are where God is to be found. Others, non-believers, insist that religion, and perhaps ethics too, lacks rigor and any possibility of falsification, and therefore cannot make valid truth claims. We're all familiar with materialists who are convinced that all talk of mind, let alone of soul, is unwarranted. We have heard and read Freud. We have absorbed the claim that religious belief is an illusion with profound roots in adult need and childhood projection, and that religious rituals stem from obsessive-compulsive neuroses. Intellectual integrity demands that we give a hearing to these and similar claims. Faith demands that we find ways to parry them or overcome them or get around these claims somehow. And if we are successful at that effort, we come to a point, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, great Jewish thinker in 20th century America, when we know that God, whose countenance we cannot see and whose nature we cannot understand, is present in our world and wants something from us, the problem, Heschel said, is, quote, how to tell it to our minds, end quote. Time is short, as Pirkei Avot warned 2,000 years ago, and the work is great, so I will stipulate here, without pausing to argue the point, that none of the challenges to faith that I just mentioned attracts or concerns me overmuch. The question that I engage today is what a Jewish human being like me, a religious human being like me, makes of the relationship between the set of convictions, communities, and practices that we call Judaism, and the set of convictions, communities, and practices that we call science. The matter is not simple, so I'm grateful that our time today is very short, because that means that you can't expect much of me today. I can't do more than say a few useful things about our subject. I look forward to hearing your responses. So the best place to start, I think, might be with the verb forms in the title of my talk, seeking and hiding. We might say that seeking is common practice to both Judaism and science, and that ultimate truth in both domains has at least so far eluded us. I expect that it always will. In my reading, God's statement in Exodus chapter 33 that no human being can see God's face and live is not a threat, quote, come too close, Moses, and I'm going to kill you. And it's not just a statement of fact like, quote, look directly at a solar eclipse and you're going to be blinded. But it's an expression of human resignation placed in divine speech that God is God and we are not. The 13 attributes that the Torah has God proclaimed right after this statement reduce, I think, to two, justice and mercy. We human beings have to know that when we act to increase justice and mercy in the world, we are doing the work God wants us to do. Only when I looked at the text through the eyes of an artist, whose paintings of these chapters taught me to read them differently, did I realize that God not only says no to Moses' brazen request to see God's glory, God also offers a powerful yes beyond anything Moses could have imagined. God would not only pronounce God's attributes before Moses and invoke God's personal name, but, quote, when my glory passes before you, I shall put you in the cleft of the crag and shield you with my palm until I have passed over, and I shall take away my palm, and you will see my back, but my face will not be seen. One cannot find more anthropomorphic language than this in the entire Torah. God has a palm and a back as well as a face. God comes near, places Moses on a rock, and removes a covering palm. And this speech happens right after 3,000 Israelites have been killed for the sin of worshiping a molten idol. That's a matter for another day. For me today, the point is that the ability of human beings to penetrate the ultimate mysteries is circumscribed, and that there is a kind of knowing that does not come via cognition, but rather from action and experience. I will not take time to run through the well-known options for how science, in quotes, might relate to religion or reason to faith, for we would first have to define our terms, it being obvious that there's no one thing called science or religion. Indeed, there's no one thing called Judaism, and we would have to decide whether we are talking in each case about a practice or about the results of that practice that have been accepted as authoritative by a particular community. Only then could we decide whether religion needs to bow before the authority of science, or vice versa, the options that sociologist Peter Berger cleverly terms reductive and deductive, or the option he calls inductive, whether we are going to work within our faith tradition, interpreting it in accord with multiple inputs of reason, tradition, and experience. That's the way every religious tradition that I know of has adopted to change of circumstances and culture. And that is the path I have taken. An ongoing process of negotiation where none of those three sources of knowledge and authority is given a veto power over the other two, and any sense of finality or wholeness, therefore, remains elusive. We balance repeatedly, constantly, without end, among reason, tradition, and experience as best we can. We seek, and God hides. Sometimes we seek more, and sometimes God hides less. Sometimes we want to be found, and sometimes we do not want to be found. Heschel, who is more important to me than any other modern Jewish theologian, writes in the first chapter of his Philosophy of Religion, which he called Man is Not Alone, from 1951, that, quote, the search of reason ends at the shore of the known. On the immense expanse beyond it, only the sense of the ineffable can glide. That's a clear echo of Kant, right? The phenomenal realm is not the same as the noumenal realm. And reason tells us that reason should not remain within the limits of reason alone. But for Heschel, unlike Kant, reason is not the highest faculty. Philosophy, he believed, will not conduct us to the living God. Faith means leaving the shore of the known. We sail, he said, I'm quoting, because our mind is like a fantastic seashell, and when applying our ear to its lips, we hear a perpetual murmur from the waves beyond the shore. Heschel respects reason. He has no argument with science. His philosophy of religion was followed 3 years later by a philosophy of Judaism. But he's certain, in that book, God in Search of Man, he's certain that God is in search of human beings. The Torah and the prophets tell him so, and he himself has experienced God's call, an event to which he offers powerful testimony at the end of chapter 9 of Man is Not Alone. Just going to quote you one or two lines of it. Staggered, embarrassed, we stammer and say, he, let's translate he as God, whose question is more than our mind can answer. God to whom our life can be the spelling of an answer. Reason, tradition, and experience have joined to summon him to a life dedicated to serving God by loving God's creatures. And as if Heschel had not given us enough of a gift in those words, he gives us another gift on the very next chapter, because right after you read these incredibly stirring words about God, you turn the page and you find a chapter with a single word title, doubts. Doubts. Which for me was a very powerful thing to find out, that even the great Heschel, after his climactic experience of God, has doubts. I prefer this sort of negotiation among reason, tradition, and experience to a zero-sum contest between religion and science, or even a clear division of realms bounded by solid yellow lines that cannot be crossed. Here's another example from a 20th century Jewish thinker that means a lot to me. Martin Buber, in his book of commentary on the book of Exodus, titled Moses, the Revelation and the Covenant, Buber provides an interpretation of miracle meant to get round the sort of challenges to miracle and to faith mounted so effectively by David Hume way back in the 18th century and many times since. What happens when the Israelites find themselves, after fleeing Egypt, with Pharaoh's army bearing down on them from one side and the sea in front of them on the other side? The book of Exodus reports that, quote, the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry ground, end quote. Buber reads this as an ascription of natural events to divine action, which is quite common to the biblical authors and to the Bible's protagonists. The point is that there was wind and the sudden transformation of the sea, a tidal wave perhaps, and the Israelites reacted as they did. And here are the key sentences in Buber's account. Miracle is not something supernatural or superhistorical, but an incident, an event, which can be fully included in the objective scientific nexus of nature and history. The vital meaning of which, however, for the person to whom it occurs, destroys the security of the whole nexus of knowledge for him, and explodes the fixity of experience named nature and history. So, this is how some of the people among those Israelites experienced the event. God had saved them, but presumably there were other people there who breathed a sigh of relief when they got to the other side and said, wow, that was a great coincidence that tidal wave happened just when we needed it. The Torah gives us the song of exaltation that expresses the experience of the first group, those who had witnessed miracle. Buber continues this way. The real miracle means that in the astonishing experience of the event, the current system of cause and effect becomes, as it were, transparent and permits a glimpse of the sphere in which a soul power, S-O-L-E power, not restricted by any other, is at work. To live with the miracle means to recognize this power on every given occasion as the affecting one. Buber called this stance elsewhere, abiding in the astonishment of the moment. I confess that I came to appreciate his words fully only after being graced with what remains the most powerful religious experience of my life, watching my first child emerge from the womb. My wife had less good a view of the event, of course, and so a different sort of religious experience. But for me, having reviewed the chapter on reproduction in my high school biology textbook beforehand, and having taken a Lamaze class with my wife, I knew something about the objective scientific nexus, the system of cause and effect that governs the event of birth. I can only tell you that my immediate reaction when the nurse handed my daughter to me was to dance around the room with her, singing, "Baby, baby, I hear a symphony," and to explain over and over again, dozens of times, uncontrollably, "Thank God, thank God." I had been vouchsafed a glimpse of the soul power at work. A less religiously inclined friend might have said, and several did, "Of course you thank God in that moment. You were excited, but you know, really, that God had nothing to do with the birth of your daughter." I'll tell you that you cannot convince me to this day that that is true, even though I, of course, cannot formulate for you, or for me, exactly what God's role in this event was. To this day, in Buber's words, I live with the miracle, I abide in the astonishment of that moment. When I read the great 20th century Jewish thinkers in the West, it strikes me that some of them are Jewish selves living inside a non-Jewish culture. Freud was not entirely wrong, about religion. Some of the claims made by some religious traditions, including Judaism, are illusory, and I do not give them credence. Some ritual performance is obsessive-compulsive, and I avoid it. Some gods are father figures or mother figures, alternatively loving and abusive, idols which I will not serve. Science cannot but impinge on the faith of a member in good standing of our culture. The prologue to my theological essay takes the form of a fictitious correspondence between me and several of my friends. So I wrote this correspondence with my friends, but they respond in their voice that I've written, right? Their voices are captured by me, and I in turn captured elements of my own thinking by ascribing it to them. So here's an example. And then there is the problem of the universe, writes my friend Adam. He has just read an op-ed piece in the New York Times entitled "Aliens Must Be Out There," which cites as evidence for that claim the fact that our sun is, quote, one of an estimated 100 billion or 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and the Milky Way is itself one galaxy among hundreds of billions or perhaps trillions in the observable universe. Adam continues, quote, "We've talked about this, you and I. For both of us, such calculations are cause for sheer terror. Remember the image of the young Woody Allen, unable to sleep at night because the sun is due to burn out in a few billion years? We laugh at that, uncomfortably, because we share little Woody's anxiety at some level. The fact of infinity, ungraspable, inconceivable, unimaginable, does not help me feel at home in the universe. It does not help either of us sleep soundly. Fear and trembling run wild. What do they do to your theology?" Well, theologian Philip Hefner opens an article that attempts to examine the ways in which the theory of evolution is potentially important in Christian theology, that's a quote from him, with the question, quote, "Is the cosmos essentially friend or foe?" The answer given by the Christian theologian, he says, will be that the cosmos is a creation and therefore ultimately it is friend. I go back and forth on this question. Adam reported accurately on my terror at the notion of billions and trillions of galaxies and stars. But then there was the moment a couple summers ago when NASA released those photographs taken by the Webb telescope, and we all got to look at light that no human eye had ever seen before, believed by the astronomers to be 13.1 billion years old. I stared at my inbox, agape with wonder. It occurred to me that the author of Genesis must have written that book's first chapter, out of a comparable experience of overwhelming awe. The Torah's account of creation is not an argument from design, as some people think it is. It's an outburst of ecstasy, a shout of exultation. In the beginning, God created, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The report in the Times read like Kabbalah rather than like the news that's fit to print. Quote, "We humans really are connected to the universe," one scientist reflected. "We're made out of the same stuff in the landscape." At the end of the day, in light of experiences like this one and the darkness that surrounds us, one keeps searching for an elusive God out of yearning, which we know is precious, painful, and inevitably connected to love. My favorite hymn in the Sabbath prayer book, written by a mystic about 800 years ago, declares to God, quote, "I shall chant melodies and weave together verses, for my soul thirsts for you. Though I have never seen you, I would tell of your glory. I imagine you, I describe you, but I know you not. In endless visions and countless metaphors, they describe you, but through it all, you are the singular one." That is the spirit in which we do theology, we seekers after God. And while we search, we, like King Lear, can live and pray and sing and tell old tales and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies. I love that line. I wrote my theological essay in part to answer the question posed by a teenager who stood up from his seat in the back of a synagogue where I'd given a lecture early in my career as chancellor of JTS. But Professor Eisen, he said, what is true? What is true? His question has never left me. I honestly do not remember how I answered him. I hope that I gave him a version of the lessons that Moses teaches near the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the very last speech he gets to give before he dies. The hidden things belong to the Lord our God. The revealed things belong to us and our children forever to do the words of this Torah. We don't have access to the ultimate mysteries. You can't always get what you want. But if we try sometimes, we do just might find that we get what we need to lead a good life. We have wisdom from many cultures and from our own experience. We have science and other kinds of knowledge, such as the arts. We have blessings of community. We have one another and the experience of giving and receiving love. We are thus equipped to do what another of Moses' final lessons commands us to do in God's name. Life and death, goodness and evil, blessing and curse are set before us. Choose life so you and your offspring can live. You can do that, Maimonides insists. You must do that, the Torah commands. It takes faith to have the confidence that if we try sometimes, we just might find that we do get what we need. It need not be illusion just because we want it so badly. We can tell that to our minds. We can win the mind's assent. And for the time being at least, we can abide with grace in miraculous astonishment. Thank you. You should call on people.
All right, let's get some questions from the audience.
I always like other people to call on them so nobody gets mad at me for not seeing their hand or not calling them. I found in my experience it's a bad thing. So have other people call on you.
Introduce yourself if you could.
This is a question which is rather much off of the topic, but perhaps not. Is there in contemporary Judaism any of the same type of science denial that we find in some types of American Christianity?
You do find some, but to tell you the truth, I mean, Chava might disagree with me. It's a non-issue for most Jews. And there's a book about that by a guy named Shai Cherry, who did his PhD at Brandeis and tries to explain why Darwin never upset the Jews very much. And even for the ultra-Orthodox, who you might expect is a problem, it's not on their radar, it's not an issue for them. So they figure, okay, God's there, God created the universe, it must be okay. So they are not terrified by the billions of galaxies. Right? Or by fossils, they just say there must be some explanation. Right? Even if you take the account literally, which some of them do, they don't have to be Orthodox. You don't have to take that account literally, right? But if they do, they just find, okay, there's some explanation that's going to turn up one of these days that we don't currently have. It's not a life. There are much more important things on their minds.
So I don't know if this was planned to be timely or not, but with Purim being so close around and the whole tradition of that there's not actually one time that God's mentioned directly in the book of Esther, and the whole allusion to God concealing himself within humanity. I was wondering what you thought, how that might play into this idea of God is working through humanity.
Right. So Purim is coming, for those of you who don't know. The holiday of Purim is coming, and we read the book of Esther. And the book of Esther is famous for God not being there, but Mordecai, the hero of the story, along with his cousin Esther, says, if you don't do it, Esther, help will come from some other place. And place is one of the ways that Judaism talks about God. God is hamakom, which means the place. So that could be a hidden reference. That sentence could be a hidden reference to God. And the general assumption of the pious is that God is there behind the scenes. And that's one of the reasons why the book of Esther has such appeal to contemporary Jews, because many contemporary Jews have not experienced God directly, but they like to believe that God is active behind the scenes in history in some ways, right? And so, yes, this fits my thesis. So there are a lot of sections of the Bible which have God all too present. But God is too much there. People don't want God there as much as God is there part of the time. But God is there watching and rewarding and punishing. And a lot of people think that's the only strand in Judaism. And I find that that belief that that is the only strand in Judaism is very harmful to a lot of contemporary faith, particularly because of the Holocaust. So if you take the book of Lamentations, which attributes the destruction of the temple and the horrible things that happened in Jerusalem entirely to God's actions. You have pounded us. You have destroyed us. You have burned us. If you take that as the only Jewish view about God, you come up with an answer that a contemporary theologian, a man that I actually like named David Blumenthal, wrote a book called Facing the Abusing God. And he said, face it, our tradition said God is an abusing God. And I said, thank you, David. I'm not going to worship a God like that. Because I don't want to believe that God is an abusing God. So therefore, I have to find a different philosophy of history. Right? And Judaism is full of them. But a lot of people don't know that and therefore are turned off to their tradition really by ignorance. But there's a whole tradition about the hiding God, which is that where was God? We don't know. God hides God's countenance. So some theologians argue that God hides God's countenance in times when awful things happen like this. And it's a catchword, really. It's a placeholder for we just don't know. But other people believe that in the modern period in general, because that science and religion are out of phase, or God is not part of contemporary culture except, on the fundamentalist side, that God is totally in hiding from today. And I found that very comforting because, frankly, a lot of us search for God and are frustrated in that search, and we blame ourselves. And I know a lot of religious people, not only Jews, who blame themselves because they should be able to find God. Oh, am I not worthy? Does God not want to grace me with God's presence because I'm not worthy? I find that really unhelpful. And so I find this whole tradition in Judaism, don't expect God to be there. There's the great Hasidic teacher, the Chavi knows well, Nachman of Bratslav, taught, he searched for God all the time, and he's as pious as you can get, and he couldn't find God. And he finally concluded, God's not here to be found. There's good reasons I can't find God, because if God were here, there wouldn't be room for anything else. So God had to do contraction to make way for all of us. So that's like the book of Esther. So God's not there to solve your problems yourself. So you got to fight evil. There's evil. Don't depend on God to fight the evil. Go fight the evil, which is what Purim is about. There's evil. Right? Purim does not let you deny the fact that there's real evil in the world. Right? You can't deny there actually is evil. So go fight it. Do good. Don't depend on God. Don't wait for God. 9 times out of 10, God's going to disappoint you.
Other hands, go ahead, Laura.
A question. In discounting the quantum theory, Einstein is famous in saying, God doesn't make mistakes. How would you respond?
So, Chava knows a lot more about this than I do.
Well, we have some theoretical physicists here.
No, but the part that you know more about, I know nothing about the physics, okay? I read what I can read about the physics for ordinary, ignorant people like me. But according to Jewish mysticism, God does make mistakes. And I think a simple reading of the Bible shows that God makes mistakes all the time. God misjudges situations. God is not fair, right? And this is, I think, when you're overly pious and you try to justify God all the time, you lose track of what the Bible is saying. The Bible is a realistic, adult, serious book, right? And so it has God messing up all the time, right? And it's like, okay, deal with it. Like, that's part of what these authors, these biblical authors, are so good that way. And the rabbis, when I say the rabbis, I mean the rabbis, the sages of 2,000 years ago who left us the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Talmud, they would say, it's too difficult to say this, but. And that's how they would offer criticism of God. Or they would put criticism in the eyes of, like they would ask difficult questions, but put them in the mouth of a Roman. Right, somebody else who was not a Jew, they get to ask the difficult questions. Like one of my favorites is there's a Roman who's putting Rabbi Akiba to death. Right, the Roman general, Rabbi Akiba was killed in 135 during the Bar Kokhba rebellion for teaching Torah when the Romans forbade the teaching of Torah because they saw it as a political act. The Jews were busy rebelling against Rome, so you weren't allowed to teach Torah. So he's putting Rabbi Akiba to death, and he says, tell me, if God loves the poor, why doesn't God take care of them? It's a great question. And then you have this whole dialogue when he's about to put Akiba to death, and they're having this great Talmudic discussion about why, if God loves the poor so much, God wants us to take care of them instead of God taking care of them. Okay, that's typical. Where's God? There's all these people starving. What's God doing about it? If you do nothing, God does nothing. And yet we thank God for feeding everybody. God feeds them when we feed them.
I think Harold Kushner said the same thing, that God is not powerful.
Right. Right. And I have my admiration for Harold Kushner and my disagreements with Harold Kushner, but he was a great, great leader. And the book that he wrote has saved so many people, so many people. He wrote a book you may not know called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And I'll tell you, in my experience at JTS, even though I'm not a rabbi, because I was the head of a Jewish institution, people related to me oftentimes like a rabbi. And I can't tell you how many people blamed themselves for the suffering of their loved ones. It's horrible. And Kushner's book, you're not meant to. That's not what the tradition wants you to do. But it's such a human thing to do. What did I do wrong? Why is God, that's the book of Job, right? Why is God punishing me this way, right? And I can tell you, so many people came up to me, these are the discussions I treasured. Rabbis get this all the time. And they said, I stopped going to synagogue when I prayed to God to heal my mother, and God let my mother die, and I decided I'm not talking to God ever again. It's a very human reaction. But it's sad they're denying themselves the pleasure of a community and maybe whatever meaning they would get in life from that religion and its rituals because they had a theology that disappointed them, right? And I can go on, I have a soapbox about this. I cannot stand part of the Yom Kippur ritual because part of it seems to say that if you're good, God writes you in the book of life. If you're bad, God does not write you in the book of life. So a guy was killed in my wife's synagogue in Elmira, New York, crossing the street to go back to synagogue for mincha service in the afternoon of Yom Kippur. And a car runs him down. What are we supposed to say about that? So he didn't get another year of life. Did he do something really bad to deserve that car running him down like that? Come on. So you can't take it literally, right? I would cut it out. There's some prayers, right? When I was chancellor of JTS, I got to be a little controversial, but there's some prayers I would cut out of the prayer book. That's one I would cut out. Because it does damage to people, because they take it literally.
Then okay, Ken, go ahead.
I guess I have two questions. One is that at the very end you mentioned the arts, but throughout your talk, a lot of the load-bearing moves in the talk turn to metaphor and aesthetic experience. And so I'm kind of curious, in religion science, why isn't it romantic religion and art? And my other question, I guess, is, especially in these answers, you've offered us a set of moves that look like they move in two directions. One is God is the thing that is ineffable, and so anything that's sort of concretized out of that is, as it were, merely tradition. I mean, we could, if we wish, undo it. And I guess maybe it's a question about where you said for the conservative tradition. But you also just suggested that God, that you revolt against the idea that he's a sort of abusive father, but he is a mistake-making being, which is not quite what we mean, I think, usually, when we think about God as someone who's worthy of worship.
So I said that the Bible portrays God as a mistake-making being, and that certainly Kabbalah performs a great service by saying that if there's evil in the world, that there must somehow be evil inside the Godhead. So I take Kabbalah and Hasidism are essential to my Judaism because they teach us that what we're trying to get at is beyond getting at. Like you have your two choices. You can be silent, or say that we can only say what God is not. We can never say what God is. So we're going to keep quiet much of the time. Or we can have a profusion of thousands of images, which is the way Kabbalah goes. And I think that since our knowledge is so limited, right? There are certain things, as I said, that I think we have to believe. Like we have to believe somehow that justice and mercy have to do with God, because that's an imperative. We have to know that when we perform acts of justice and mercy, we're on God's side. We're doing what God wants us to do. So that's indispensable. But for the rest of it, you don't have very much knowledge at all. What you have is seeking. And I find myself seeking and sometimes having these experiences of transcendence or glimmers of religion, or I find that prayer is somehow answered, or it's much too complicated to even figure out. And so I write the book, once I realized what I was doing, I was writing out of yearning. And then when you start looking at it, you realize how much theology is explicitly about yearning. And all this medieval devotional poetry that I happen to love, even though if you take it as making truth claims, I don't believe the truth claims they're making, but I read these, Solomon Ibn Gabiro, Yehuda Halevi, I love these people. They are so precious to me. And they also are saying they're writing out of ignorance and of love and devotion. And what Heschel taught me, that God is in the realm of the ineffable, our life can be the spelling of an answer. I love that line. Our life can be, God asks a question. You can't answer the question with explanations, let alone with scientific explanation, but your life can be the spelling of an answer. The answer to your first question is, I'm just more comfortable with words. And there's a man that Chav and I are friendly with, a couple together. So there's a painter named Jill Nathanson, who's an abstract painter. Her husband, Alan Astro, was here a couple weeks ago. He's a physician, cancer oncologist with my mom.
Met him, actually.
Yeah.
Right.
And Jill and I worked together, as I said, on the Golden Calf chapters, and she taught me to see things I'd never seen before. And I know that I love Cezanne. I know that I love Kandinsky, but I could not explain to you why I love what I love. And I read a lot of stuff about them, and I don't feel comfortable writing about them. Similarly, I grew up with serious music. I was taking piano really seriously from the age of 8 to the age of 16. And so as I was maturing as a thoughtful Jew, I was also immersed in music. But then I left it. And to tell you the truth, I feel guilty about leaving it. And I know that I've harmed myself in my perception of the world by leaving the world of music behind, and it's not been as important to me as it was when I was 16 years old. So I enjoy listening to music, so that's why I didn't include it much. But I think you may be referring to Michael Fishman. You know Michael Fishman? Michael Fishman is a theologian he just retired from the University of Chicago, and he wrote a book called Sacred Attunement. And he thinks that faith is not a matter of knowing, it's a matter of attuning ourselves to experiences and aspects of reality, especially of the arts. So he makes this whole thing about painting and music and poetry and how those are the ways. And I think that that's probably true, that why do we assume we're going to get to God through language? Why not assume that music is going to take us there as well, precisely because you can't translate music into words? Poetry is a much better vehicle, I find, than theology. That's why I like these medieval devotional poets so much. They're poets. Right? I love the language. That was a long answer. That was a great question.
Yes, indeed. I'm inviting Ben. Go ahead.
Thanks for your great lecture. I want to ask you to dwell a little bit more on some of the tensions that popped up but passed by in what ultimately has a kind of harmonious feel in your telling. And you began with not from cognition but from action and experience, and the story of the birth of your daughters in that mode. But coming back to the very first question about, maybe it's not present in Judaism, but the sort of Christian science and religion. It seems to me that a lot of that stems from the kind of 19th century constructed conflict in which the science was a gotcha science. And thus it became a question of authority and of truth and of who's worshiping, the true God and who's worshiping the idol, basically. One can work past that in the ways you suggested, but it seems to me we're in a kind of different moment where we've moved from gotcha science to what you might call appropriative technology, where the kind of experiences where the beyond cognition, but practice and experience is getting colonized by forms of technique and technology that are largely about laying claim to what we thought those domains meant, but because you can simulate them, because you can transform them or manage them or control them or objectify them, render them mechanical, they're evacuated of what you thought they were full of. And your story of the birth of your daughter is a rejection of that. But it's a rejection that maybe is increasingly requires a repudiation also. I mean, listening to you talk about poetry just now, I'm thinking about how fascinated we are with forms of AI that can trick us into believing that these machineries are great poets, and it's sort of a attenuation of the significance of poetry. So where does, for us moderns, where the kind of tension between secular existence, in which the achievements of the sort of merely human, grounded in nothing but our own ingenuity and knowledge, are competing as a sort of font of meaning and are demanding that we recognize them and, venerate them as such? Where does that hunger that you talked about fit into that? Because it's supposed to be, it lays claim to the role of sating it, but in a way that's utterly unsatisfying.
Yeah. So, as Ben knows, I was influenced in a formative way by the sociologist Max Weber's great essay, Science as a Vocation, because I read it as a senior in college in a seminar for graduate students in sociology at Penn, and I was the undergraduate. And we went through it line by line, sometimes word for word, for an entire semester, with Philip Rieff, if those of you know the name Philip Rieff. And Weber says, there are many paragraphs that mean a lot to me, but one of them is he's worrying that specialization and subspecialization have really narrowed our ability to speak about the important things in life. And I certainly feel that way. I'm distressed when I read a lot of people writing about the ethics of this and the ethics of that, and I think that they don't know enough about the this and the that to write about the ethics of it. And I'm critical of some people who write about science that way, and I myself, because of the way we're raised, I don't know a whole lot about science. I'm an ignoramus, and so I've never felt, I thought it would be pretense for me to take on these people, and so I think, I'm trying to be honest now, another one of the things we learned from Peter Berger. I'm sorry to answer, but we have time?
Yeah. We have
Okay, so 3 minutes on Peter Berger. So Peter Berger died a few years ago in his 90s. He was a great sociologist, sociological theorist. He taught at Boston University for many years. And he was important to me personally beyond anything he wrote because he was both a sociologist of religion and a practicing Lutheran. And the fact that he managed to combine those two things with integrity meant a lot to me, because there's a line at the end of Science as a Vocation where Max Weber reached out to me from the grave. He wrote this in 1917, and in 1973 I'm in Philip Rieff's seminar, and Weber says, "The arms of the old churches are open widely to receive you. All you have to do is sacrifice your intellectual integrity." So to be a person of faith, all you got to do is sacrifice your intellectual integrity. And I made a kind of vow at the age of 20 and said, damn it, I am not going to be sacrificing my intellectual integrity to be a person of faith. So Berger doesn't want us to be deductive, that is to say that whatever the religious tradition says is true, and so damn what the scientists say, forget all about it. So you're deductive when you say the truth is all in religion. So Genesis says 7 days, it's 7 days. Right? And he doesn't want us to be reductive, which is we give the territory away to the scientists. We give religion away. So there's a line in the great Mordecai Kaplan's book, what do you call it? Modern man, Judaism for the modern man, I think that's what it's called. And he says, to the modern man, religion can only mean X. And the gender is not coincidental. To the modern man, religion can only mean, and that's what Berger would call reductive. So what science says it is, that's true, and you sort of adapt yourself, and if religion says something that contemporary science doesn't agree with, then that can't be true, and we throw it out or find some symbolic meaning for it. So Berger wants us to be inductive, which is the strategy I've taken, which those of you who know Christian theology know was a strategy first employed notably by the great Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was the founder of mainstream Christianity in the 19th century and is influential to this day. And Schleiermacher puts the emphasis on religious experience, and tonight I'm going to be talking about that more. Your world under this dome of truth where everything comes together. And then in the modern world, it splits apart, and you have what he calls the heretical imperative from the original Greek meaning of heresy, which is choice. Right? So we're pulled in 1,000 different directions. We have to choose. Okay, so what do you do Now we're at the point, in answer to Ben's question, what do? You have to create what he calls structures of plausibility. You have to create structures in your world, which means institutions and communities, which are strong enough so that you don't face all these challenges alone as an individual, but you face them in the context of a community and a tradition, which is the way Judaism has reacted to the world all the time, because we're always a minority tradition, right? Minority under the Romans, a minority with the Christians, a minority with Islam. We were a small minority tradition, so we learned from the outside, but we survived by having structures of community and tradition that were strong enough to bring things in, but also hold our own integrity. That's the path that I've taken. And that's the path, the only path I know to recommend. And what you know more about this than I do. I'm hopeful that we're reaching a point, and maybe the enterprise that we have here at ASU is a sign of it. We're reaching a point where it's no longer a zero-sum game. And if that's the case, thank God. If we can get out of this so-called contest between science and religion, life will be much better, because there are a lot of people, here's a generalization, but I think it's true, there are a lot of people living without ultimate meaning in their lives because they do not believe it can be found. Because they believe Stephen Hawking, and they believe Richard Rorty. They believe that it's all a matter of opinion. As chancellor of JTS, I used to go to Jewish day schools. So there's this 10-year-old in a 5th grade class who says to me, you know there's no such thing as truth. I said, oh yeah? So is thou shalt not kill? Is that like a matter of opinion? He said, yeah, I share your opinion. I think it's also wrong to kill. But that's just the two of us. That's our opinion. It's not that it's true. A 10-year-old in Boston at a Jewish day school. He had absorbed the culture already by the age of 10. And the number of relativists in my class at Stanford, I would say most of my students were relativists. Right? So some things are absolutely wrong, like sexism is wrong and colonialism is wrong, but wrong is just a matter of opinion. Right? So if you can get by this conflict, if you can take it on head on, I think that's your work. If anybody here can take on this work head on and say that it's not a zero-sum game anymore, we're getting past that, God bless you. And our culture needs this. And so many people are living without faith, and I deal with them in a pastoral sense, even though I'm not a rabbi. But as the chancellor of JTS, they come to you and pour out their hearts. And so many people are living with, they desperately want meaning with a capital M. They desperately want meaning with a capital M, and they feel like their culture has denied it, which was Weber's conclusion in Science as a Vocation. The man wanted to be a believer, but he couldn't because he thought it was untrue. It was inauthentic.
Go ahead.
Yeah, since you brought up Mordecai Kaplan, I think I should, but and also by way of sort of reducing your theology into more of a essential principle, because your theology is one that's very balanced between the various forms of knowledge. So my question is pretty basic, actually, and that's, why do Jews need God at all? Like, if we can jettison the
You
idea.
have a better solution?
Well, we can jettison the idea that God is an abusive father. We don't want that. We don't want to worship the abusive God. Why not just jettison God altogether? We have tradition, we have culture, language. What does God do for the Jewish people?
Well, but that's not up to us to decide. So your question, I'm smiling because I got your question from students, undergraduates, inevitably at Columbia or at Stanford. And they would say, like, why does Heschel need God? After all, he wants you to be a good person. So can't I just be a good person and that's the end of it? I said, yeah, God bless you. You want to be a good person? Be a good person. And there's a wonderful line in the Talmud where God says, if they abandon me, let them keep my commandments. If they abandon me, let them keep my commandments. But for me and for other people, here I'm with Heschel. You know, I didn't grow up. He grew up in a Hasidic world in Poland. I grew up in Philadelphia in a conservative Jewish congregation, and so I went to public schools. So I was a product of two cultures from the very beginning. And thank goodness, I wouldn't have traded that for anything. But when Heschel says we sail because our mind is like a fantastic seashell, and when applying our ear to its lips, we hear a perpetual murmur from the waves beyond the shore, I subscribe to that. I have not only these yearnings, but I have these experiences. And I trust them. I don't dismiss them. I trust them. And I go with them. And so for me, the idea that there is more out there than we can know, William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, calls it the more, with a capital M, the more. I believe that there's this more. And if I only have one life to live, which is what I assume, I want to be in touch with this more if I can. It's a longing. And my tradition encourages me in this. So while I'm busy trying to do good things in the world, I hope I can also search for God. And I believe that God underpins all this stuff, but only if we make it such. But, Kaplan, so those of you, everybody here know about Mordechai Kaplan? Well, it's a question, we should go with that question. But Mordechai Kaplan, we now have his diaries. And the Mordechai Kaplan of the diaries was a searcher. Unlike the Mordechai Kaplan of his published books, who is certain about everything. He changes his mind 5 times in a chapter, and he's always certain of everything he says he's certain about. But in the diaries, he's wonderful. He's a seeker. And he loves Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he loves Henry David Thoreau. And he loves transcendentalism. And he loves mysticism. And he's a wonderful, it's sad.
No, but that's why civilization is the conclusion of all of it. Kind of, you bring it in.
You bring
Go
it in.
ahead, Barry.
So, first of all, wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.
There were threads that were sort of competing in your essay, and so I'd actually like to draw you out specifically, have you talk about that tension. But before I would reflect that as a scientist, we obviously search for truth. But as Ian Barber, for instance, and others have, and so many have shown, that it really is a communal effort that moves towards truth. So if I make a measurement and 50 other people make a measurement that's contrary to that, then as much as I can be convinced that, boy, I did this thing right, I have to recognize that, gee, maybe did it wrong. Maybe I need to do it again or something. And so in your talk, there was this tension between your personal search for truth, but you spoke of tradition and the role of the community. So if you would you explicitly talk about how that tension settles itself between your personal truth and your community's truth? Because obviously you live in a thriving community, but there are times when, as you say, you're controversial. You make changes. So if you could just talk about that for a little bit.
And I chose in the book to exemplify what I was doing rather than actually address that point directly, and hope that people would get it from the way I'm doing it rather than from addressing it directly. Look, let me be autobiographical again. One of the formative moments in my life, and it's not just one moment, it happens over a period of time. So I went to a public high school in Philadelphia, which is an academic, public high school. It's like a magnet school for Philadelphia. All boys at that point in time. Now it's co-ed. My favorite teacher was a Catholic guy named John J. Malloy, who taught us intellectual history, but he taught us things that weren't in the curriculum. And then I would walk down the street, literally it's about half a mile away. I went to Hebrew high school for 11 hours a week afterwards. So I was going back and forth between the two civilizations that Mordechai Kaplan talks about. And the formative experience that I'm about to mention is we studied the Torah in the original Hebrew with the medieval commentaries in the original Hebrew. And you read these medieval commentaries, and there's a point where there's a commentator named Nachmanides who says, Rashi said this, and he was wrong. Ibn Ezra said this, and he was wrong. I'm going to tell you what the text means. And I got the message which they were trying to teach, and most of my teachers, in fact, were conservative Jews, rabbis. So this was the message they were trying to teach, which was, take a seat at the table, get into the practice, learn enough, and you too will become a partner in this conversation over the course of the generations. And what you are going to say is not restricted by, there's some grammatical, that the theologian Lindbeck at Yale called the grammar. So I can't say that God is 3 and not 1 because I'm Jewish. But I can say, because I'm Jewish, that God has 10 sfirot, as the Kabbalah said, and each of these 10 sfirot has 10 sfirot, etc., etc. There are thousands of aspects of God. I can say that, but I can't say that God is a Trinity. So there are grammatical rules about what I can do that restrain me. But other than that, it's a matter of integrity. Learn enough, right? Practice enough. Make yourself an heir to this tradition that you in good faith can adapt it, can change the circumstances, and then go forward. So that was the tradition that I came from. And I've tried to follow that. And the fact that, I won't give a lecture about the different kinds of Judaism here, but that's squarely in line with a tradition that was called the Historical School in 19th century Germany, and the great Solomon Schechter brought it to America and founded conservative Judaism in America. And it had much more practice than Reformed traditionally did, much more Hebrew, much more textual study, but also an emphasis on changing with history. And it had less theology. One of the things I would fault conservative Judaism for, it had too little theology. Reformed Judaism had much more theology. So one more story. I have time for one more story?
Go for it.
So we were looking to make an appointment in Islam at Stanford. And I was the chairman of the department of Stanford. One of my great joys was to meet an Islamic legal scholar and theologian named Sherman Jackson, who I think went to USC. He was at University of Michigan. I think he went to USC. And we had the following conversation in my office. He said, I'm writing an article called, Can a Muslim Swear Allegiance to the American Constitution? And he knew the answer had to be yes. And he also knew that there was absolutely no precedent in the entire history of Islam for someone giving an answer of yes to that question. So how was he going to do it? And he said to me, I love this. He said, you play by the rules, right? And if the process is the process that your community and your tradition have engaged in, and you come out with a different answer than has been before, then it's okay, because the process was the right process. In other words, you have community and you have tradition. And I said to him, that's fantastic, because we at the moment, in my tradition, are wrestling with the rabbinic ordination of LGBT individuals. And the first thing I had to do when I became chancellor of JTS, when the law committee of conservative Judaism had just decided that it was actually okay to do this, we had to decide at JTS if we were going to do this, and I was in charge of that process. And so that was the most consequential thing I ever did at JTS. But it was a matter of adapting Jewish law, knowing that there was absolutely no precedent in Judaism. For women studying, there was precedent. And we found ample precedent for having women study, which is why even ultra-Orthodox Jewish women today are studying Talmud. But there was no precedent whatsoever for ordaining an openly LGBT individual. None. And yet we did it. Right? So we followed a process, which is a time-honored process, controversial, and came up with this answer, right? And so I think that's the answer to your question. So we were meant to have this tension that you picked up on. I live with this tension. But I also believe, not because God tells me to do this, my tradition wants me to do this. The Torah, if I can personify the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, wants to be alive today. And it knows that in order to be alive today, it has to have people like me living this tension and adopting it to current circumstances and interpreting it in ways that hadn't been interpreted before. And I am convinced, if it's not already true, there must be people who have written about chapter 1 of Genesis differently because of those photographs from the Webb telescope. Chapter 1 of Genesis now reads differently to me because of those pictures and that light. I'm sure that's going to, so we're meant to have theology this way. And that's why, right, I think that the notion of a solitary individual is kaput. It's not only scientists and religious people who are members of communities, we're all members of communities. And our bodies are ecological communities, aren't they? With all these millions of organisms living inside of us. And we are communities with those rocks out there and those trees out there and all that. That's a current way of thinking that also attacks the 19th century notion of the solitary individual, which lived well into the 20th century.
I think your comment about, my experience is by definition too narrow for 8 billion human beings.
Exactly. That's why we need one another. And instead of needing one another and learning from one another, we close ourselves off and rule out contrary opinions and, censor ourselves and close ourselves off to things. It's like so sad. So sad.
It's God choosing a people.
Another question. That's a different lecture.
Aaron, you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. How do you know? I didn't raise my hand.
Well, I know that you want to say something.
So it's more observation than a question. But so I'm also a scientist like Barry. I'm actually an astrobiologist in part. So with astrobiology is the study of the distribution of life in the universe, and seeking to understand why it is what it is, whatever it is, right? And so your comments about Webb telescope and the fact that it made you feel unsettled, right? Then it's
but also that it had a religious experience, both.
Right. So what came to my mind is a quote from a famous science fiction writer, a brilliant guy named Arthur C. Clarke, you've probably heard of him, who said that two possibilities exist: either we are alone in the universe, or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Right. And I think to approach those possibilities with reason, they are both terrifying in all sorts of ways. Right. So when I'm part of this community of astrobiologists that's actually engaging in trying to answer that question, which is it, right? Are we alone or not? And very rational people, all scientists, most would profess to not be religious at all, right? That they would reject religion. And yet they, if you ask them, well, how do you deal with this? They give you all sorts of answers that are essentially rationalizations, right? Essentially, they have a kind of a faith, right? That you have a setup, that it'll be okay, right? Somehow or other, if there is life out there, it'll be benign because the rules of evolution somehow will select for, some form of ethics, right? That they don't express it that way, but that's kind of the implication, right? And if we're alone, well, we'll figure out how to manage, right? Somehow, right? The most of them gravitate towards the idea that we're not alone and that they find comfort there, right? But the whole field, right, is a field of people sort of, in a subconscious way, manifesting a sort of a quasi-religious faith. So to your point earlier on, right, where do we find God, right? Is it the job of religion to find God, or is it in part something we find in the sciences? I think I see kind of in that science, right, an emergent kind of a sort of a faith, which I worry about sometimes as a scientist, because that can lead you to down to see what you want to see, whatever. But from a broader sort of humanistic standpoint, it's an incredibly humanistic science, right?
So apparently the physicists are the most religiously inclined of all the sciences, and the chemists next, and the biologists least, because of Darwin, I think. Tell me, but doesn't quantum physics tell us that the law of contradiction no longer applies? I read that somewhere. Is that wrong?
Well, that'd be a question for Barry. He's a physicist.
But when you make an observation, that applies.
But when you have a lot,
It's live and dead, right?
but when you have an X or not X, does that necessarily stand? Either we're alone or we're not alone. Only two possibilities.
Once you do the experiment.
Once you do the experiment, okay.
It's the intermediate stage where the law of non-contradiction
Right.
applies. We'd say that a cat can't be both alive and dead at the same time. Well, it is in that intermediate before you make the observation.
And religions, I'm going to use the word progress, or they usually they adapt themselves to changing conditions and commitments, because individuals within those conditions, they become experiments. In other words, they have no choice. In order to be themselves, they have to move the tradition in a certain direction. And the great Gershom Scholem was fond of saying that if you want to know if a religious innovation is going to succeed or not, hang around for 300 years. And that's our problem. So that's, as you said, you don't know what the subsequent findings are going to be. So for the moment, you've got something. But I happened to be at Stanford for a while with some scientists who had thought they'd made discoveries and they couldn't be replicated, and their life's work just went up in smoke. It was either a Nobel Prize or I wasted 20 years. And it turned out to be wasted 20 years. And I felt like that's incredible. But that's not a waste, right? You're contributing to the community, right? And I feel that way about Judaism. I feel like all of us are learning from one another on this path. And so we'll find out in a few million years whether there's actually, or 20. Yeah, well, yeah, that's what's scary. So the lifespan is not in sync with the needs of knowledge, right? Yeah, we don't live long enough to really find out.
But this is one of the answers we may have. This is a question we may have an answer to in the lifetime of any of us in this room. So.
Really?
Yeah, it's possible.
You think? Wow. Wow, that's just...
Prove the negative.
So,
Can't prove a negative, but we could prove a positive, right?
righty.
This is such a pleasure. What a pleasure for this. I mean, isn't it great? This is wonderful.
Welcome to ASU.
Thank you. Bring me back. I want to come back.
Okay, Michael.